The Group of Seven, or G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, with the European Union as a guest, is meeting in Hiroshima on May 19th to 21st. Japan is the president of the G7 for 2023. A Government of Japan concept paper sets out as a priority for the Japan G7 presidency continuing the strengthening of global health architecture. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has explained that Japan's presidency would focus on boosting multilateral cooperation to drive, amongst other matters, public health. The focus of my talk is what Japan could do during the remaining term of its presidency and beyond to advance its goals of strengthening the global health architecture and boosting multilateral cooperation to drive public health. My talk addresses one particular aspect of public health: international organ trafficking. Compelling evidence has established that Chinese official institutions, hospitals, and prisons on an industrial scale kill for their organs prisoners of conscience, primarily practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises Falun Gong. Also Uyghurs in large numbers. In smaller numbers, Tibetans and house Christians, primarily Eastern Lightning, are victims. The organs are sold to transplant tourists and wealthy or well-connected Chinese. Because of its G7 presidency, Japan holds a unique position of potentially leading in developing solutions to this global health problem. To lead others, the Japanese government and parliament, Japanese companies, and the Japanese transplant profession must first make changes in Japan. I suggest a number of them. 1. Japan should stop the export of transplant technology into China. Prohibited goods could include supercooling refrigerators used for organs, organ preservation solutions, and extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO devices. 2. Japan should stop the export of anti-rejection drugs into China beyond current levels. A transplanted patient needs anti-rejection drugs after transplantation. Keeping exports at current levels would work to ensure that the ban does not impact adversely on those who are already transplanted patients. 3. Japan should impose a ban on the importation of organs for transplant from China into Japan. The city of Busan, Korea, in November 2022 hosted a symposium to canvass ways in which Japan, Korea, and China could collaborate and seek ways to build a cooperative transplantation system. One of the speakers proposed an emulation of cooperation in transplantation within Europe, the transportation of organs from China to Japan and Korea. 4. Japan should prevent the health insurance systems, both public and private, from reimbursing the cost of transplant tourism into China. The Israeli Organ Transplant Act 2008 prohibits any Israeli entity from contributing to the funding of transplantation outside Israel if the transplantation violates Israeli legal standards. 5. Japan should require reporting by health practitioners to a central registry of the transplant tourism of their patients. The Taiwan Human Organ Transplant Act provides that, and I quote, patients who have received an organ transplant outside Taiwan and are going to receive post-transplant follow-up treatment in a domestic hospital shall provide the hospital with the following information in writing: category of the organ transplanted, name of the country in which they received the transplant, name of the hospital where the transplant took place, and the name of the physician who performed the transplant. The policy goes on to say that the law goes on to say the hospital may report the case to the central competent registry. Japan needs a similar law, but with compulsory reporting. 6. Japan consequently should require the central competent authority to whom reports are made to make public aggregate data of all transplant tourism from Japan with sub-aggregates for each country of destination. 7. Japan should impose an entry ban on anyone about whom there is reasonable grounds to believe is complicit in organ transplant abuse. Canadian immigration has a law like that. Number 8, Japan should revoke or refuse to issue a passport to a person while on parole who had been convicted of cross-border organ trafficking. The U.S. House of Representatives has adopted a bill like that. Number 9, Japan should impose Magnitsky-type sanctions on those complicit in organ transplant abuse in China. Japan is the only country among the group of 7 without this legislation. The legislation provides for freezing assets of publicly named human rights abusers and denying them entry to the country. Number 10, Japan should sign and ratify the Council of Europe Convention against Trafficking in Human Organs. Though the convention was adopted by the Council of Europe, it is open for signature by any country on invitation. Japan, I am confident, would receive such an invitation should they express interest. The convention obligates states parties to enact extraterritorial legislation prohibiting complicity in organ trafficking abroad. Number 11, the Japanese Parliament should enact extraterritorial legislation of this sort, whether Japan joins the Council of Europe Convention or not. There are 20 countries now with this legislation. 15 are states parties to the Council of Europe Convention, and 5 are not. Number 12, Japan should cease training physicians who intend to engage in transplantation in China. Chinese transplant hospitals and transplant wings of general hospitals have short bios of transplant physicians, which shows that several were trained in Japan. While not all transplantation in China involves abuse, the lack of transparency in China is such that it is impossible to tell which transplantations there are not abusive. The clerk of the Queensland, Australia Parliament, in response to a petition reported in December 2006 that Queensland's 2 major transplant hospitals, the Prince Charles Hospital and the Princess Alexandra Hospital, had taken measures in light of the evidence of organ transplant abuse in China. Prince Charles Hospital developed a policy of not training any Chinese surgeon in any transplant surgical technique. Princess Alexandra Hospital decided not to undertake any sponsored organ transplant research or training with China. Number 13, Japan should avoid engaging alone or in coordination with others in transplantation research which relies on organs in China or from China with unexplained provenance. The International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation in April 2022 stated that in light of the evidence of transplant abuse in China, submissions of data related to clinical transplantation or the use of tissue from human donors in China would not be accepted for presentation at a society-sponsored meeting, or to the society register, or for the publication in a society-sponsored journal. The Japanese publications, and this is my 14th recommendation, should not publish transplantation research where organ sources are not traceable. A British medical journal publication in 2019 noted that, and I quote, research shows that this standard of not publishing research where organ sources are not traceable has been widely violated when it comes to publication of China-based transplant research, leading to several paper retractions after publication. In order for the standard to function in an effective manner, there should be at least a checklist for all transplant papers, itemizing regulatory information about organ sources. Number 15, Japan should not fund any Chinese transplantation institution. The China-Japan Friendship Hospital, located in Beijing, was established jointly by Japan and China in the 1980s. The hospital engages in transplants. Japan should not be sending any funding to this hospital. Number 16, Japanese transplant professionals should avoid attendance at Chinese transplant conferences. For the October 2014 transplant conference in Hangzhou, China, many invited overseas transplant experts declined to attend because of the evidence of transplant abuse in China. Number 17, the Japanese pharmaceutical companies should not undertake trials of anti-rejection drugs for transplant patients in China. Some pharmaceutical companies, notably Novartis and Pfizer, have stated they would not undertake these trials. The United States National Library of Medicine runs a website setting out clinical trials of drugs worldwide. The website shows that the Japanese pharmaceutical company Astellas has engaged in a number of clinical trials of anti-rejection drugs throughout China. They should develop a policy to end those trials. Japan should should enact legislation to address body exhibits, and this is my last recommendation. Body exhibits are not organ transplant abuse. However, they are cognate similar fact evidence. Many of the bodies in various exhibits come from China, and within China from police sources. The evidence points to the sourcing in China from prisoners of conscience for both organs for transplants and bodies for exhibits. The legislation should require verifiable documentation showing consent of the individuals whose bodies were put on display after death, or the consent of their family members. The legislation should require verifiable documentation showing the sourcing of the bodies. And the legislation should prohibit sourcing of bodies from prisoner detention or police. A body exhibit displayed in Kyoto between December 2010 and January 2011 led to complaints to police. The Kyoto District Public Prosecutor's Office told the complainants a year later that the office was not going to prosecute the Japanese organizer of the exhibit because of the difficulty in establishing that the organizer intentionally violated the law. Since then, there have been no exhibits involving plastinated bodies in Japan. Nevertheless, it would be advisable to enact an explicit law addressing the exhibition of plastinated bodies. Leaving the matter to the interpretation of an unrelated law, applied or not at the discretion of prosecutors or those responsible for giving permission for the exhibits or public campaigns against the exhibits, are weaker solutions. In conclusion, let me say that before Japan can reasonably lead the G7 on combating global organ trafficking, the country needs to get its own house in order. Although this talk has given examples from other countries, other companies, non-Japanese companies, and other professional associations, no country has a complete and comprehensive response to global organ trafficking in general and to organ transplant abuse in China in particular. If Japan were to adopt this comprehensive response, it would be an example to the G7, which it now leads, and to the whole planet. Thank you.